Many years ago, I remember walking around my grandmother's farm. She had acres and a lake and a little house and a barn out in the middle of nowhere in Texas. And the grass was tall and dry. It was in the middle of the summer. She hadn't yet cut it down for hay bales. And as I was walking along the edge of the lake, I passed the hibiscus plant that I bought her for her birthday years before. And I remembered that moment because I was living with her at that time that I purchased that plant, and it was symbolic. She loved gardening. She loved having a green thumb. And it was this regenerative gift that I gave her that she told me that she wanted. And she was somebody who never told me what she wanted. And so the one time that she did, I made sure that I absolutely bought it for her. And she took beautiful care of it. But fast forward a couple of years later, when I was no longer living with her, and I was starting to undergo this shift in my personality, this shift in my identity, it was hard to explain. All I knew is that things didn't feel right in my life. And as I continued to walk around her lake to the barn, I felt this gnawing sense of agitation is a little bit too strong of a word. Dissonance is a better word. And dissonance is that feeling that you get when you go back to a place that used to be home, that used to give you a sense of relief, like, I remember when I would be driving to visit her. As I was getting close to her farm, I would get excited and I would feel like, finally, I'm almost there. I'm almost home. I'm almost home. But when I started undergoing this change, there was this subtle shift to where the energy of her property and the energy that I was carrying was no longer a match. And I remember looking around at the scenery that I used to love, that I used to feel so connected to, the big open sky. And I remember feeling so out of place, like I didn't belong there anymore. When I went back inside to visit with my grandmother, we were back in our routine. We had a habit that we would talk and we would catch up, and sometimes we would sit outside on her deck that she had built over the lake, and other times we would sit inside on her couch with her in her winged back chair and me sitting next to her on the sofa. Well, not really next to her, but beside her chair. While we would have some TV program playing in the background, but not really watching it. And this time we set out on the dock, and I remember feeling so incredibly like a fish out of water, like I didn't know how to talk to her anymore. I didn't know what to talk to her about. And what used to be a comfortable silence that would fall between us started turning into an awkward, heavy silence, tinted by discomfort and this feeling of uncertainty. My mind was somewhere else, but I didn't have the words to pull down anything to share with her. Dissonance is that feeling that you feel before you break up with somebody, before you get divorced. It's that gnawing feeling before you decide to move out of your parents' home, before you make a big transition in your career. And the thing about dissonance is that oftentimes we're unaware of it. In fact, I was unaware of this process until I met a friend in Bali and we were having lunch together. And she so perfectly described what I was going through, which was the beginning process of a major, major transformation. And the process that leads, the internal process that leads that transformation is the feeling of dissonance. And very often, we stay for a very long time until that dissonance becomes so uncomfortable that it forces us to move. It forces us to change. It forces us to leave. And where I see a lot of people make mistakes is that they don't, myself included, when I was unaware of this process, they don't recognize it for what it is, which is an invitation to reconfigure your life. And what happens is that they will actually carry the discomfort and the pressure with them everywhere that they go. And the way that they deal with it can sometimes be in toxic or unhealthy ways, or they ignore it and they deny it and they try to shove it down. And the more that they do so, the more they imprison themselves. And I've met a lot of people that have been unhappy in marriages, and they have been unhappy for a very, very, very long time, sitting with the feeling of dissonance and also feeling trapped all at the same time. And some partnerships are not conducive for you to reconfigure things. A lot of people have excellent partnerships where you can grow together. I had one of those for a while. And it's beautiful because anytime you need to, it's kind of like Tetris, you need to shift things around and reconfigure the arrangement, you can have a conversation about it. If you're working with somebody who is mature and or enlightened or conscious or conscientious, then you can actually just talk about it and solve it together. But where it gets a little tricky is if you have somebody that you can't do that with, or if deep down you know, and I have a couple listeners that are going through separation and divorce, you probably felt this. Deep down you know that it's not right to continue. And you might have a partner who is willing to reconfigure things with you, and who might even be trying to beg you or to plead with you that they will change. And I would say, be careful and trust your intuition on this, because in my experience, personal and also working with clients, is that the height of change happens when you start walking away. And when you are dealing with somebody that actually does not want to change, that is actually trying to preserve something like a family unit, or sometimes it can be about income or a business, some extraneous thing other than your happiness or the primary relationship, especially if there's any sort of inclination towards upholding an image that everything is perfect, or any sort of disturbances in the personality and a fear of failure in society's eyes. So they need you to stay. And what can happen is that the changes that are made can be temporary. And then when you come back, because their level of dissonance isn't matching yours. They actually become more comfortable the closer you come back and return. So then the pressure point to change goes away. And it starts this dance. And you'll see this with people who have been married a long time, but who are deeply unsatisfied or looking outside of their relationships. This dance happens that's sort of a push and pull, where one person will start to walk away, and that's when the other person starts to reach for them again. And they can go years, 5, 10, 20 years without any sort of intimacy or any affection or any real caring. And finally, the person that feels uncared for, ignored, neglected, abandoned, whatever it is, finally they work up the courage to start making moves, because that dissonance gets so strong inside them that they're like, I can't live like this anymore. I'm not going to live like this anymore. And so they start walking away, and then boom, what happens? The other person tries to bring them back and seduce them back. This is one of the hardest shadow patterns because it can be very confusing. Because the core issue is actually not solved. And the offer of reconciliation, it's not always 100%, so you have to take it as it fits to your case. But what can happen is that those wake-up calls are really just snooze buttons. Somebody's reaching over and tapping the snooze button, but then going back to sleep. And so then you have to go through it all over again. In some cases, the wake-up call is effective, and it does shake people out of their complacency. But you have to be mindful about the type of partner and their level of maturity who you're working with, because if you have to walk away or break up with somebody in order to induce change, especially if you've been having repetitive conversations and they seem to hear you, but there's no actual behavioral change at the end of it, or you feel unheard or gaslit, then you're living in an illusion. And your partnership is not really reciprocal in terms of them caring about your needs, or vice versa, because it can go the other way too. And in situations like that, there's an ulterior motive for holding on to the configuration. And when you start to understand why people stay attached, why people stay enmeshed, and why people don't actually want things to change, it's because deep down it's not about your feelings. It's about them getting something, having something, showing something, doing something. Because if it was truly about your feelings, then you sharing your feelings, you showing your feelings, and expressing your feelings would result in a change. You wouldn't have to go through the whole process of trying to walk away. And dissonance, when you are aware of it, is a signal to you that you're outgrowing something. And it's a signal to take those Legos or the Tetris blocks and to pull them apart and put them back together, or to actually step away entirely. In my case, with my grandmother, I could feel that my sense of home was changing. My behavior paradigms the way I enjoyed socializing, the way I enjoyed spending time with people was undergoing a radical shift. It had nothing to do with the love of my grandmother, but she was fixed. She was an older woman who had a lot more experience than me, and I was fitting into her life. I was fitting into her social structure. She raised me for certain parts of my life. And so, as a result, I had no expectation that her and I were going to relate any differently. And the way that she liked to talk and what she liked to talk about and who she liked to talk about was very rigid, as is the case for a lot of older people. They get into a rhythm, and that's what socializing is. And for me, I started feeling repelled by that way of socializing. In fact, I started being repelled by social behavior almost in its entirety, which upset a lot of my friends and family because I would go long periods of time not answering my phone, not responding to text messages. And then I started quantum jumping and quantum leaping, and I could feel that I couldn't answer, even if I was up for it. But I also happened to not be up for it because I was exploring this entire other world, and I didn't want to talk about what we had for lunch anymore. I wanted to talk about the satellites and servers and consciousness backing up and AI and multi-dimensional existences. And so the point is that when you start outgrowing your life, you start outgrowing the social paradigms that you used to be stuck in. And when you were there, it didn't feel like being stuck. It felt like it was familiar, and it felt like that's what you do. But when you start to undergo some pretty radical shifts in your awakening, and not everybody has wild personality shifts, but a lot of people do. And a lot of people even go by different names. I have a second name. For example, many people have many names, actually. And when you understand the value of a name, you understand that it tells you how you're operating in the world with your identity, which tells you how you're behaving. And that tells you where you're fitting into. And so a lot of people, when they start to have really big shifts and awakening, they start going by different names. In my case, Sophia, my personal life, because it reminds me to be different. It subconsciously pulls up a different social paradigm. But what's interesting is that when I am fully in Dr. C, it's challenging. It's like I repel the Sophia name because it's a different energy. And so now you have a couple of different templates. If you start using different names, you have a couple of different templates for how to embody your person, your identity. And when you embrace that dissonance is an invitation to shift, you actually shift a lot faster because you don't resist it. And then when you give yourself the latitude to have a different name, to associate with people differently, to have different conversations, to change your world, what you'll find is that you may never actually want to go back to the old way of being, but you might sometimes. And by carving out the understanding, you carve out space to fit in to multiple places, multiple timelines, multiple existences. And that is part of breaking away from the construct of a unidimensional existence, And you can start by seeing your dissonance for what it is, the path to transmutation, calling down or receiving your second or your third or your fourth name, and practice exploring what type of person wants to emerge when you use that name or hear that name.